Good morning, Journey, and happy Sabbath. We are back for another edition of Sabbath School for April 24th, 2021.
Mhm.
And again, it's Pastor Adam Jesus here, and we're going to have a conversation about this week's Sabbath School lesson from I believe, the 17th to the 23rd, and it's an everlasting covenant, um, which I find interesting, and that's something I think we'll discuss over the course of this, right? um, is because whose covenant are we specifically talking about today?
Abraham's.
All right, so Abraham kind of being, some would say, the first that God enters into a covenant with, if you don't count Noah's thing. And so, but Abraham is kind of like the big one. And in fact, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being the patriarchs of the Jewish faith, and also to some degree within Christianity. So we're talking about the Abrahamic Covenant that's found throughout the book of Genesis. And so what's interesting is what the Sabbath School lesson seeks to do first is unpack a name, and a very specific name, and a very important name. And that's what we call, in fancy speak, the Tetragrammaton, which is the sacred name of God, the four letters that make up the name of God, because in the original Hebrew, there were no vowels. Vowels were actually added later in the Masoretic text. And so in the original, it's Yod He Vav He, that makes this what many people will call Yahweh. But within Judaism, they would actually say, why am I like Adonai instead? They would say Adonai instead of actually saying the name of God, because the name is so sacred that one does not say the name of God. And I don't know what you thought about this, Jesus, because I agree with them, like 100%. I agree that names are important, and names, like how they said, names are like trademarks. Names tell you something. That's one of the reasons that when I came to Glendora, we changed the name of the church to Journey, is because Glendora SDA Church literally only told you two things about the church. One, it was an Adventist church. Two, it was in Glendora. Doesn't tell you anything else.
Right.
Names can give identity to things. Naming is incredibly important, right? And I agree with them that with God, that is no different. However, I don't know if you saw, Jesus, when they talk about the name, they talk about it being derivative of the verb haya, which is to be, which true. But then they say, in which case it would mean the eternal one, the existent one, the self-existing one, or the self-sufficient one, or the one who lives eternally. And I'm like, sure, that feels like a little bit of a stretch to get all that from there. I mean, because as they correctly identify in Exodus 3:14, when Moses asks, well, who do I say sent me?
Right.
God says, I am that I am, or I will be what I will be. And so yeah, I can see where they come to the conclusion from. Like, it's not way out in left field, right?
Right.
But I feel there's a little, maybe you can help me, elucidate this. Like, this is that barest stretch, right? That's just a little. I feel there's a little bit of a stretch going, not a large one, but a little bit of a stretch with that. Like, I think that they're focusing kind of maybe on the wrong thing. With the eternality and all that stuff, sure, but I actually agree with them more when it talks about like the existent one or the self-sufficient one. It's that perhaps less of, oh, I live forever. It's more of the fact of, I am that I am. I don't need a name because I just am. And I don't know about you. I think there's like, I don't want to say swagger in that, but there's like this kind of boldness that only comes with that, like, extreme contentment and confidence in oneself. Like, so go on.
I mean, and since we're on the topic of just this name, this, right, like, even the example you used of Moses asking God who he was, and even the name changed from Abram to Abraham, and then from Jacob to Israel. So like all these things, right? So it's important for sure. And I think one of the things that I learned in one of my philosophy classes this week is this thing called it's a scholastic idea. Scholastic philosophers, Aquinas coined this term too.
Mm-hmm.
It's agere sequitur esse, and it's basically Latin for action follows being. And I think that's more important. I am who you say I am, right? I am, right? That's cool. Like, I understand. But what is it that I am entails? What is it the action that I am carries?
Right.
Or even like in marriage, right? Like traditional marriage, usually the woman will take on the last name, right, of the male. Like, that's just traditionally what it is. And
but
yeah. And so even in that, like, right, there's a name change and there's an action that follows that name change, in the sense where, like, you two have become one, And so really, I think that's what matters most, is what happens when we ourselves get that name change. What happens when Abraham gets that name change, and what actions follow after that.
That's really
and I like what you're saying too about it being bold. Like, like even God to say I am, like, that's bold, because it's like, okay, if you say I am, now you need to prove that you are, and you're not going to prove it with your name. You have to prove it with your actions.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It's because a name without any action is just words, right?
Yeah.
And words without any action are just words. Like we say oftentimes with the boys, an apology without action is empty words. Right? And it's not you don't just say you're sorry. You are sorry, and you show that you're sorry, And so, I like how you put that. And I think it's interesting that God, when speaking with Moses, and then in the 10 Commandments and all these stuff, that God actually, that's what God, I think, reminds the people of what God has done. Why?
Right.
Because especially for God, because God is not claiming a particular name. That God is essentially claiming no name. That I am. That God has to back that up, right? And God knows.
Yeah.
And so God goes, well, I'm the one that created you. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so all of the stories there, the covenants and all the things that happened to them, and all the way that God was with them, I am that God. I am the God that liberated you from Egypt. I am the God, so on and so forth. I am the God that remembers. I am the God that sees. I am the God that hears. I am the God that provides. And if you think about it, it's interesting that a lot of those other names that people give to God, not that God gives God self, because people name God, right? Hagar and Jacob and some of the other ones, like Jehovah Jireh, right? You are the God that provides. It's like that we've attributed that God to God because of something we've seen God do. And God's like, well, I'm all of that and more.
Right.
And so, I really like how you put that. And honestly, for the course of this, and then I like how you put it with us, with our names. And I actually, thinking about the marriage thing, I think that the best thing for a couple to do is hyphenate, actually, because then you're taking the two names and making something new out of it. And then you can kind of like have that new identity together. And some cultures already do that, right? And so you have like these two families coming together here, or these two ideas, or two people coming together into a new thing. And then what does that mean, right? Because the name is important.
And sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but like I like that, honestly. The fact that God just introduces his name, or when he comes to contact with some of these characters reading the scripture, and he changes their names. Like even in the New Testament, right, from Simon to Peter and like all that. And so
Peter,
I like that, because it it's more it's less it's both, yeah, intimidating, but at the same time it's less intimidating in the sense, right? Like, let's say Moses is asking God, like, okay, who are you? And then Moses were to sit there, I mean, God were to sit there and be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be the guy that sends the 7 plagues, or right, I'm gonna be the guy that parts the sea, I'm gonna be the guy that feeds you man, I'm gonna be. And then for to not know a guy and to just hear him say all that, you're like, wait, I don't think I'm trusting you. Like, so it's a lot
That's a
easier.
little sus, right?
Yeah, so yeah, it's us. And so it's a lot easier for God to just say, look, you don't understand right now, but this is who I am. And just hear me out, trust me, and watch what we can do together, type of thing.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you. And it's interesting that God with Moses just says, "I am." And I wonder if part of that is because Moses is like, "Hey, there's all this stuff going on. Like your people are going through it."
Mm-hmm.
And God's response is, "I am." And it's interesting that God's response, almost like before the Mosaic covenant even begins, like similar to Abraham, right? God goes to Abraham and goes, "Hey, yo, I want you to move over here," right? And Abraham does and forms this relationship with God. And with Moses, Moses is there on that mountain after running away from Egypt and stuff. And God's like, "I am." And I love how it's almost like, "I am enough. Now you go back and you help, and you are going to be my representative, and Aaron as a spokesperson. Um, you're going to be my representatives to free the people."
Yeah.
I mean, God doesn't just roll up in there and go, boom, boom, plagues, boom. God sends them to declare it first and says, "Hey, let my people go."
Right.
Like, this is what the Lord wants. And so it's interesting that even here, God partners with humanity in order to make good on God's promises, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That humanity is an important element of that covenantal process. That you need both sides of the covenant in order for the covenant to work. And maybe that's some of the problems we come into, is because we're always expecting God to do all of it when we have. Yeah.
I like the way so James Cone puts it into what he calls a responsible relationship. And so I'll just read that paragraph. This is from page 59 of God of the Oppressed. It says, the covenant is an invitation to Israel to enter into a responsible relationship with the God of the Exodus, wherein God will be Israel's God and Israel God's special possession. This invitation places Israel in a situation of decision because the covenant requires obedience to the will of Yahweh. To accept the covenant means that Israel must now live as Yahweh's liberated people, becoming the embodiment of freedom made possible through the freeing presence of God. The covenant not only places upon Israel the responsibility of accepting the absolute sovereignty of Yahweh as defined in the first commandment, it also requires Israel to treat the weak in its midst as Yahweh has treated it. And I like that because it says to accept this covenant means that you must live as Yahweh's liberated people. Even if you are not free yet, you must start to live in that freedom. And again, so there's an identity change. You've gone from oppressed to free. Even if you're still oppressed, the covenant calls you to live freely.
Right. And it's interesting because I find Israel almost, in modern day Israel especially, kind of betraying that covenant. But then at the same time, like, it's interesting because I think they're being true to the Abrahamic Covenant. Because the Abrahamic Covenant promises two things:
right,
descendants and land. That's what it promises. Those are the two promises to Abraham. This is the promise that Joshua brings back into the promised land during the horrors that happened in the book of Joshua and that attempted genocide of Canaan. And basically is this idea of, God promised us this land.
Right.
And then Israel collapsed and broke up and got exiled. And after all that, when it came back together, and it was mainly just Judah and, but Israel And then after the destruction by the Romans, and then with the Zionist movement in the 20th century, and then that move to the modern state of Israel, and then their treatment of the Palestinians, it's like, I think that while they might be true to some degree to the Abrahamic Covenant,
Right.
definitely not being true to the Mosaic Covenant and the official covenant that God, because one could argue that the Abrahamic Covenant is a covenant that God makes with Abraham. Right, this is very specifically God and one person. Now, granted, it's talking about blessing the descendants and all that, whatnot, but it's really, honestly, the deal that God makes with Abraham. And technically speaking, God didn't have to hold that deal with anybody else. However, with the Mosaic Covenant, it's not just Moses; it's Israel.
Right.
And I like how Cohn puts it, that expands it. That puts more responsibility on Israel, not less, right? And that says, hey, you guys, if you're going to be my people, you're going to be a priesthood to the world, and you're going to have to treat people the way that I've treated you, and do for people what I've done for you.
Right.
And I would argue that there's a lot of instances where that does not happen with any even spiritual successors of this through Christianity and Adventism, right? Is that or kind of adjacent partners in this covenant, like by extension.
Yeah.
And then there was something you wanted to bring up specifically about this whole idea of covenant.
I appreciate first of all, I appreciate this idea of conflict between covenants. I think that definitely something I never thought about, and so I would love to look into that a little bit more, just this how these covenants conflict with one each other. But my problem with covenant is just like, even with this idea that it sounds easy. It doesn't sound easy, but it sounds nice to live freely even though you're oppressed.
Right.
And that's not easy. That's really hard. So yeah, it's like this. My question is like, how do we lean into these covenants, whether it be Abraham's covenant to have this everlasting covenant where God will be with you throughout your generations, or whether it be what's it called, Moses covenant. Like, how do we trust these covenants when it seems like God is not keeping up his end of the relationship?
And then the natural question there would be, how so?
Yeah.
And you had a very specific example.
Yeah. During, like, just right now, a lot of Christians are in need of comfort, especially Christians of color, especially our Black communities, more recently to our Asian communities, and now even our Sikh communities, and now our Spanish. So just like, right, all our communities are in need of comfort. And I know this week was a huge relief, weight off a lot of people's shoulders with the trial of the dude who had killed George Floyd. And one of the things that one of my professors had asked me, they were like, hey, how are you taking this all in? And I said, it was a relief. It was for sure relief, but it didn't last too long, because the trial doesn't take away from the fact that George Floyd should still be alive.
Yes. And
it didn't last too long either, because within hours, a young little teenage girl also lost her life. I think her name is Ma'Khia Bryant. To a cop who had killed her too. And so it's like, yeah, there's no, like, my first initial thought would be like, there's no covenant there. Like, well, how do you expect me to believe that you are going to bless us for generations and you're going to free us and this and that? because it seems like what we're living through right now is the complete opposite. So right now, for me personally, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm just living in between the Beatitudes. If I'm not mistaken, Matthew 5:4, 5:5, where there's a lot of people who need a comfort. And so I'm trusting Jesus will comfort those people. And for those of us that have the strength to keep fighting and who are still hungry and thirsty, then we got to keep fighting. Those of us that can, those of us that are thirsty and hungry, we got to keep doing it for those of us that are in need of comfort. That's kind of where I'm at.
Well, let me ask a question. How does Jesus comfort them?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question.
By what means, right? What's the vehicle that Jesus uses to bring comfort to those who need it?
I mean, I know he uses other people, you know, like he calls, but like that's my dilemma. It's like, bro, like I'm tired too. Like
Right.
I'm crying too, but you want me to put that aside to go help that person who's crying, or that community that's crying. And I get it, right? We're called and we have responsibility. But again, it's like, bro, you don't, like, you do it. Like, you keep saying you're gonna do all this, but you keep calling me, so it doesn't make sense to me.
And that's ultimately the kind of the dilemma, right?
Mm-hmm.
I actually want to take us to Matthew 28 for this. It's because I actually think that in Matthew 28, this might sound weird to some of you, but I think in Matthew 28, actually a much more pertinent covenant for us than the Mosaic or the Abrahamic or any of that. Like a much more pertinent covenant God actually makes with us in Matthew 28. Now, as the Sabbath school lesson says, the covenant comes in 3 stages: approach, command, and promise. God approaches and God says who God is. God says, well, what is expected of you? And then God says what God will do, right? And so Matthew 28, at the beginning of Matthew 28 is the resurrection of Jesus. So I think that is God establishing who God is and who Jesus is, right? Then Jesus actually tells the disciples later in Matthew 28, go ye therefore. Now specifically teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and teaching them everything I've commanded. But I think that go ye therefore is important because I think it not only encapsulates everything that Jesus said, but everything that Jesus did and everything that Jesus was. That we go therefore, that we go and do likewise, as Jesus tells them in the parable of the Good Samaritan, that we go and do likewise. Then the promise is, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, as much as my heart breaks with everything that is going on, I understand that it is 1,000 times worse for different communities. That is a mere pigment, a fraction, a pixel of what others are experiencing. And the fatigue is real, right? The fatigue is real because this is lived experience. And for some, this might be an abstract, oh, this thing happened in the news today. But for many communities, this is a very real thing, tearing communities apart. And justice was served in that trial, but you're right. The best justice could have been, maybe not even real, the best justice would have been George Floyd being able to go home to his family.
Yeah.
The best justice would have been that 16-year-old girl being alive. And we have to, so part of it is there are many who are still deceiving themselves and deluding themselves about the nature of this beastly system that we're in. And we have to come in it with eyes open. And you're right, man. So it's like, who brings the comfort? I believe it's the people of God that bring the comfort. You know, who's the one that brings that and brings the peacemaking, brings all that stuff? We have been called by God to be the people of God, and therefore the people of God should be bringing that. And I think that as we band together and if we do it as community, if we're not doing it as little islands, each one of us doing our own thing, but if we're doing it together, God is there with us and God pours into us and gives us the strength to do it. And, I think it all comes back to the community of God, right? The community of Christ, the body of Christ, is that this is our sacred duty and our sacred task. And part of that is protest, and part of that is peacemaking, and part of that is bringing comfort, and part of that is hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And God promises to be with us through it all. I mean, remember, we have to understand that the life of Christianity has never been meant to be one of like comfort. Now, I want to say comforting is different than comfort. Right? Being comforted is different than comfort. See, a lot of Christians have conflated that, right? That the Christian life is supposed to be one of relative ease. And that's actually not what Christianity is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the long and narrow road, the hard road. And so for those of us, especially those of us who have been called to clergy, I believe we have this responsibility to walk that road. I mean, look at Jesus. Jesus is mourning the death of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was killed in a horrific and arbitrary and ludicrous way. I mean, the death of John the Baptist is a ludicrous story. It's nuts. Like, what? It is so callously and casually cruel. And Jesus is trying to mourn. But then the people show up. They bust in uninvited.
Right.
And Jesus looks at them and loves them and sees them as sheep without a shepherd. And so Jesus helps them. Even in the midst of Jesus' own suffering and even in the midst of Jesus' grief, Jesus knows that this is what we're supposed to do, is help each other. What I think needs to happen is within our communities of faith, white people need to step up and do more and be more vocal and lean on things and start throwing that privilege around. And they need to start saying, this is not okay. And we need to start pushing on reforming or defunding or tearing apart, honestly, the police force and rebuilding something else. Because, I mean, it is blatantly obvious just how skewed and messed up and corrupt it is. I love how Trevor Noah was like, people keep saying there's good apples. Oh, these are just the bad apples. These are just the bad apples. These examples we keep seeing over and over and over and over and over again. These are just bad apples. There's good cops out there. And then his response is, sure, but where are they? Where are they then? He's like, nah, the whole tree is rotten. But even the good apples either don't last long, or the good apples eventually become bad apples, or the good apples are so hidden behind all the filth and rot that it doesn't matter. Where are the good apples? Where are the good cops that are helping with the protests? Where are the good cops who are going into their own and helping internal affairs and investigating their own people? Where are the good cops saying these police unions are a problem? And that's the thing is hopefully this is making sense, is that we as a church are called to lean on the beastly systems and to fight the beastly systems. Not with the same weapons that those beastly systems use, because that's what Paul says, our battle's not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and that darkness of the present age, right? And this idea of almost an ideological fight, but maybe fisticuffs if need be. But this idea that we have to stand up against it, say, no, this is not acceptable, and this is not the way that God has called us as human beings to be. And we as this church will not stand for this. I mean, look at what the Christian church did in Romania, in light of the communist occupation. I mean, Christianity drove out a beastly system.
Right.
I don't think capitalism is any better, to be honest with you, especially this Darwinian late stage dystopic capitalist system we have here in the United States. Like, it's not any better. In fact, I think it's worse. And the thing is that it's not going to change. And maybe the church has to actually step up and in unified voices be like, no. And so I think that's what we're commanded to do, right? We have to keep fighting. We have to keep going. And I understand that that is a tall order to ask. And I think that there are some of us in the body that need to take more of it than others.
Yeah. This is just hearing everything you're saying is kind of coming back full circle. I kind of already alluded to it, but like prior to the recording, I told you, I got a problem with something Jesus says, obviously it being the last sentence of that chapter, Matthew 28. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. And I already alluded to that, like, really, like, are you really there? This is off, like, just, I'm going to try to put this together, see how it sounds. But I think to understand this commandment, therefore, and go make disciples of all nations, I think we have to turn to, well, what did it mean when God had called his disciples? So when we turn to Mark chapter 3, verse 13, verse 14 actually, right, says he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. So there's a couple things that are going on here. This idea that they might be with him, be with Jesus, right? And then this idea of preaching out and then preach and then have authority to drive out demons. Mark is known to have the most radical Jesus in the sense where it's like, hey, like we're on the move and we're healing and casting out,
I would argue the most active, most radical. Luke might give him a run for his money.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Most active, right? And then so, because like it's like every single chapter he's like performing some type of miracle or driving out some type of demon. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing here is he called his disciples to be with him and then gave them authority to drive out demons. Okay, cool. That's really what it meant. We go to Matthew 28, and prior to Matthew 28, Jesus died. That took away from what Mark 3 says. They're no longer with him. Like, they're not with him. Like, Jesus is dead.
And they ditched him before that.
Right, yeah. And so it kind of seems like what we see here in Mark 3, like, is non-existent. After the resurrection, and when he gives them that commission, they understand what it truly means to be with Jesus to the end of the age, because Jesus was able to prove himself on the cross and in the resurrection. And now they're like, now we understand what it means to be with you and not leave you. And now we know what it means to really make disciples. And what is it to be a disciple? Well, we see here that it's authority to cast out demons, authority to cast out those demonic systems that continue to oppress people throughout centuries, right? And so I know it's kind of hard for us to take that calling on and to be disciples. But these disciples, they didn't get it at first. And so maybe we don't get it. But it wasn't until they saw Jesus rise, until they saw Jesus with the holes in his hand, that they were like, we get it now. Like, we understand. And we believe you. We do believe you that she will be with us to the end of the age. Mm-hmm. So I think for those of us that are really struggling, I think we should turn to the Gospels now more than ever. Yeah. And put ourselves in the disciples' feet. Like, what does it mean to initially be called? Because I'm pretty sure it was a lot easier to trust Jesus when you were with Jesus.
Yeah. And even then they had problems doing that.
Right. And then ask yourself, what does it mean then when Jesus dies? Because you could argue right now, Jesus doesn't seem a whole lot alive right now with what's going on. And then what does it mean when Jesus is risen from the dead? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean when Jesus tells us, I got you to the end of this and I'm going to be here to the end. Now, but I need you though. Yeah.
Something keep in mind here. What does Jesus very specifically say at the end of Matthew 28? There's one really important word in verse 20.
Surely.
And remember. And
Sorry, I'm a different version.
in the NRSV, he goes and remember.
Yeah.
And I think the surely is sort of that, like, kind of like, this is a sure thing. And I like how the NRSV puts it to, remember. Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. And I think that remember part is super important, right? Because sometimes we forget.
Yeah.
Sometimes we doubt. Sometimes we feel like, where are you, right? And sometimes, so we have to remember this. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of this. And we see God working through the community of faith, and we see God working in the paths of justice and liberation. And for human free will definitely gets in the way of that. And human free will and evil definitely gets in the way of that. But we see little glimpses popping through. And honestly, I think what it needs to be is a reminder that we have to work harder, not less or easier. When we see, like when that verdict was given, we needed to take a moment to celebrate that not best justice, but justice had been served. Not optimal justice, but justice had been served. But then it's like, okay, we have to keep going though.
Yeah.
This was a historic trial, sure, and all that stuff, which is saying something. But we have to keep pushing, because that's the first step. And we have to, if we want to keep this from being a story that keeps being repeated over and over and over again, we as the people of God have to keep pushing, keep moving, keep striving forward, keep doing what Jesus commanded us to do, right? And keep going and doing likewise.
Yeah.
And again, I will definitely agree with you that I think that the bulk of this load, that the white community, like the white parts of our church community, need to do more. They need to step up more. They need to speak up more. They need to be more active and more involved in this, and they need to be pushing harder. We need to give spaces for voices of color to speak. And there are times where we need to speak so that we can give them a break, and that they don't have to keep doing this work of unpacking these things and all of these prejudices and biases and racist ideologies and systems that exist. We have to be working on breaking them all down. And, but yeah, I think the community of faith, the church, needs to be actively, and I think this is part of being a covenant keeper, right? Because God is the God of the oppressed and the marginalized. That God is the God of those that are not free but should live free. And then that we should be making it so, like, all are free and all are equal, and not stop until it happens for everybody.
Right.
It's like, okay, right now we're doing this for the Black community. Tomorrow, and we need to keep doing it for the Black community, and then for the Asian community, and the Sikh community, and all of the communities, Hispanic communities, all of the communities that need it, right? And then once we do it for all of them, we also do it for the LGBTQIA plus community. We also do it for, like, we do it for everyone. Right? Because people are people in the eyes of God. And so, yeah, so I like the conversation that this Sabbath school lesson perhaps unintentionally has sparked. But as you have demonstrated in our conversation, like, we can't sit. I think it would be callous and empty if we just sat here and had this, like, abstract, hypothetical conversation about covenants in the face of what's going on right now. I think that would be ludicrous to do.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of our church members would prefer it that way, over spiritualized, abstract. What does this mean for me in my personal, individual gospel, my spiritual walk? What does this mean for me getting to heaven? right? How can I help other people go to heaven, quote unquote? And we're like, well,
Yeah.
that's never been the spirit of this. That's never actually been what God's been about. And even early Adventists clued into that, with so many of them being part of reform movements and everything. Like, you guys don't get it. Like, this is why it matters.
Right.
And if we're gonna be talking about Jesus as the optimal vehicle of meaning, it has to be able to speak to these contexts.
Right.
And God is a God of liberation, plain and
Yeah.
simple. So yeah, man, those are some good stuff. And what are we talking about next week to give people a little bit of a preview? Next week we're talking about children of the promise. We'll see how that goes. you know,
Yeah.
well, it looks like there might be some messianic promise and stuff in there too, so that might be interesting. But guys, remember, if you like what you're seeing here with our Sabbath School lessons, if you don't like it, if you have questions, comments, concerns, whatever, there's going to be a jot form in the description of the video. Just click that thing. It gets emailed directly to me, so you can let us know what you need. You can give some interaction and whatnot. Hopefully you guys are watching and enjoying this. And if you guys are getting edified by this, subscribe, share with people. And Jesus, is there any thoughts you want to leave them with as we head out?
Yeah, I mean, just remember that, we're studying this covenant, and word to James Cone, that means it's a responsible relationship. So let's make sure our actions follow our being. God has proven God's self. And since we're called to be disciples, let's make sure our actions follow that calling.
I like it.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Remember, God loves you very much. Remember to love each other. And remember that we at Journey SGA love you, and no distance can change that. And we'll catch you next week.